My fiancé disappeared 2 hours before the ceremony. I found her at a motel with him. She laughed when she saw me. I let her finish, then called her father. The morning of my wedding didn't feel real. It was like watching a movie about someone else's life, someone who had everything figured out. The air outside the hotel was heavy with summer heat, and even the sunlight felt too sharp, like it was cutting across my skin. Everyone around me was buzzing with excitement, but I couldn't shake a strange quiet inside me. I chalked it up to nerves. Renee had texted me around 7 that morning, just a heart emoji and see you soon. I stared at it longer than I should have. We'd had a small argument the night before about her family being over-involved in planning, but it ended with her kissing my cheek and saying she couldn't wait to finally be my wife. I believed her. I always did. By 10, I was at the venue with my groomsmen. The florist was setting up white roses along the aisle. The air smelled like lavender candles and new beginnings. Her mother was fluttering around, talking about photographers and table placements. Everyone kept asking me how I felt, and I kept saying excited. But under that, there was a tremor I couldn't define. At 11, the makeup artist mentioned Renee still hadn't shown up at the bridal suite. The hairstylist assumed traffic. The maid of honor said she'd gone out for a walk earlier to clear her head. That made me pause. Clear her head? On the morning of her wedding? Still, I brushed it off. Renee had always been high-strung before big events. By 11:30, her phone went to voicemail. Texts stayed unread. The bridesmaids were whispering now, trying to keep calm for me, but their eyes told a different story. The makeup artist packed her kit quietly, like she already knew this wasn't going to end well. I went outside and called her again. No answer. Then I called her mother. She said Renee had left the house earlier than expected, saying she wanted to stop by the church for a moment alone. But she never arrived. At that point, it stopped feeling like nerves and started feeling like gravity had shifted. I opened the Find My Phone app. I didn't even think twice. It was still linked to my account because we'd been planning the honeymoon together. Her location showed up across town, on a service road, near a highway exit. My chest tightened. It wasn't near the florist, or the venue, or even the boutique she liked. It was a cheap motel area. I stared at the blinking blue, refusing to believe what I was seeing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe her car broke down. Maybe she needed space from the chaos of the morning. I told myself every possible excuse because the alternative was unbearable. I got in my car and drove. My groomsman, Theo, tried to stop me, said it was probably nothing, but I didn't listen. The drive felt endless. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my tux collar suddenly too tight. I remember the sound of my own breathing, shallow and fast. The way you breathe when your body knows something your mind refuses to. The closer I got, the worse the place looked. Rusted signs, half-empty parking lots, a flickering neon vacancy sign that buzzed like a dying insect. I parked and sat there for a long moment, staring at the rows of identical doors. Inside the lobby, the air smelled like stale smoke and cleaning solution. The woman behind the counter was scrolling through her phone. When I said Renee's full name, her eyebrows lifted. She said, "Yeah." She checked in around 9. Room 214. The number hit me like a punch. I stood there frozen, my tongue dry. The clerk didn't notice the silence. She just handed me a visitor's pass like I was another guest. As I walked down the hallway, every step sounded too loud. I could hear muffled sounds from other rooms, TVs, laughter, plumbing. But then I heard something sharper from the far end. A laugh I knew. Renee's. It was soft, familiar, but out of place. I stopped outside the door. My hand hovered over the handle. I wanted to knock, to call her name, to make this make sense. But I didn't. I just stood there, listening. There was another voice inside, a man's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low, amused, relaxed. I backed away, heart hammering. For a moment, I thought about leaving, pretending I never saw the blue dot, never drove here, never heard that laugh. Maybe I could still turn back, let her have whatever this was, and let the world think she'd gotten cold feet. It would be easier, cleaner. But then I thought about her message that morning, the heart emoji, the way she'd kissed my cheek and told me she loved me. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theater. She'd said those words knowing exactly what she was going to do. I went back to the door. I didn't need to knock. The curtain was half open, and through the slit I could see movement. Her wedding dress, my mother had helped pay for it, was draped over a chair. I could see her hair, that same blonde bun I'd watched her practice all week, and a man's arm resting lazily across her waist. It felt like my chest collapsed inward. There wasn't anger yet, just disbelief, so heavy it felt physical. I wanted to scream, to rip the door off its hinges, to demand an explanation that wouldn't exist. But something else came instead, cold clarity. I walked away without touching the door. I drove back to the venue in silence. When I got there, the guests were starting to arrive. Some of them looked confused to see me in the parking lot alone. The coordinator rushed up, asking if Renee was on her way. I told her there'd been a delay. My voice sounded calm, almost detached. I don't think she believed me, but she nodded and went back inside. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. My reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look like me anymore. My tie was crooked, my eyes unfocused. Behind me, the white decorations fluttered in the wind, waiting for a ceremony that would never happen. Eventually, I pulled out my phone again. The blue dot was still at the same place. She hadn't left. She wasn't coming. That's when I made a choice, not out of rage, but reason. If she wanted to ruin something sacred, I'd make sure she understood what that meant. Not with shouting, not with revenge fueled by pain, but with consequences that would echo longer than any argument ever could. I put the car in gear and turned back toward the motel. This time, I wasn't going there as the groom. I was going there as the man who deserved the truth. The drive back to the motel felt slower, heavier, like the air itself didn't want me to reach it. The clouds had thickened, and the afternoon sun had dulled into a colorless haze. My phone buzzed constantly, texts from my mother, from the best man, from guests asking where we were. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't have the words. When I parked again, I didn't go straight to the door. I sat in the car, watching it from across the lot. It was strange how ordinary it looked. White paint peeling off the siding, a dented ice machine humming nearby, the wind moving the thin motel curtains. There was no sign that my entire life had just splintered behind that wall. At some point, I got out and walked up the stairs. My shoes sounded too clean against the cracked concrete. I stood in front of room 214 again, staring at the number like it might blink and disappear. I knocked once. Nothing. Then again, harder. There was movement inside, soft, lazy, almost unbothered. Then a man's voice, groggy and amused. "Who is it?" I didn't answer. The door opened just enough for me to see him. Dylan. I recognized him immediately from old photos. Her ex. The one she said was toxic, manipulative, the reason she couldn't trust people. The one she swore she'd blocked years ago. He stood there in nothing but jeans, hair messy, a smirk on his face that made something in me go still. Behind him, Renee was sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a towel, her wet hair falling over her shoulders. She froze when she saw me. Then, unbelievably, she laughed. It wasn't a hysterical or panicked laugh. It was sharp, almost cruel, the kind people use when they think they've already won. Dylan turned, grinning, and said something to her I couldn't make out. She didn't answer. She just stared at me, then shrugged, like she was explaining away an inconvenience. I asked nothing. I said nothing. Words would have been useless. Everything I needed to know was already there. The way she looked comfortable, the way the room reeked of cheap perfume and sweat, the way she didn't even try to cover the half-eaten room service tray. He stepped aside, as if inviting me in. I didn't move. He smirked again and said, "Guess she couldn't go through with it." I still didn't respond. My silence seemed to annoy him, which was satisfying in some quiet, detached way. He kept talking, something about how I should have seen it coming, how she'd been calling him for weeks. His voice was low and smug, filled with that careless arrogance of a man who believes he's untouchable. Renee finally spoke, her tone flat, practiced. "I couldn't do it, Callan. You're safe. You're kind. But you're not exciting." I tried to make it work. The words didn't even sound like her anymore. Or maybe they always had, and I just refused to hear them. She went on, saying she'd been seeing Dylan for a while, that it started as closure and became something real. I didn't ask how long. I didn't ask why. None of it mattered. The only thing I asked, calmly, evenly, was whether she'd planned this. She looked away for a second too long before answering. Not planned. Just inevitable. That word stayed with me. Inevitable. Like betrayal had been written somewhere in fine print, and I just failed to read it. I turned around and started walking away. Dylan called after me, laughing, something mocking that I didn't fully hear. I didn't look back. As I reached the parking lot, the motel clerk was standing outside smoking. She looked at me, hesitated, then said quietly, "You okay, man?" I nodded once. It was a lie, but it was the only answer that fit. When I got in my car, I didn't start it right away. My hands were steady now. My heartbeat was calm. That was the strangest part. It wasn't shock anymore. It was an eerie stillness, like the moment right before a storm breaks. I checked my phone again. The missed calls list was endless. My mother, the best man, the venue manager, even Renee's father. I stared at his name for a long moment. The thought came to me uninvited. He deserved to know. He'd poured tens of thousands into this wedding. He'd adored me, called me the son he never had. He'd trusted his daughter to me, and I'd trusted her to him. It wasn't vengeance that made me call. It was clarity. When he picked up, I could hear noise in the background, the sounds of the venue, guests chatting, faint music. I told him there was something he needed to see. He asked what was wrong, but I told him to come alone, to meet me in 15 minutes at the Greenway Motel off Route 5. He didn't ask again. I stayed parked until his car pulled up. He was still in his suit, looking bewildered, hopeful, already pale. When I told him the room number, he didn't say a word. He just nodded and walked past me, shoulders stiff, fists clenched. I didn't follow him. I stood by my car, listening. There was silence for a few seconds, then the faint sound of yelling. A man's voice breaking into disbelief, a woman's trying to defend, another man laughing. Then the yelling turned to something deeper, a father's heartbreak spilling into rage. He came back out a few minutes later, face drained of color, eyes unfocused. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. He didn't say anything, just put a hand on my shoulder, then got in his car and drove off. The guests began calling again. One of my friends texted, asking if it was true that the bride's father had stormed out of the venue. Rumors were already spreading. Someone said Renee's sister was crying in the dressing room. Someone else said the band had started playing to fill the silence. The absurdity of it all made me laugh once, quietly, bitterly. It didn't sound like me at all. I drove away again, not to the venue but to a park nearby. I sat on a bench overlooking a duck pond where kids were feeding bread to the water. The contrast was surreal. Their laughter sounded like it belonged to another universe. I thought about how easily people can live double lives. Renee had been planning this wedding while keeping another man in her orbit, balancing both like a professional liar. There were signs, the sudden work trips, the mysterious Venmo transfers, the new perfume. But I dismissed them because trust had always been my default setting. Now, sitting there, I realized trust wasn't something everyone valued. Some people saw it as an opening. I spent the next hour canceling things. The limo, the photographer, the officiant. I told them the wedding was off and not to expect payment from me. It would all have to go through the bride's family. I used her father's name when I spoke. My voice didn't shake. Then I went back to my apartment. The suit still smelled like lavender and dust from the venue. I hung it up neatly in the closet, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table in silence. My phone rang again, her father. This time I picked up. He said only one thing. "Thank you for calling me first." His voice was broken, raw, like he hadn't stopped shaking. Then he hung up. The wedding that was supposed to unite two families had turned into something else entirely, a quiet war that would ripple through everyone involved. And somehow, I already knew this wasn't over. Renee had always cared about appearances more than truth, and she wouldn't let this end quietly. That was fine. I didn't plan to end it quietly either. The wedding venue emptied faster than I expected. One canceled event can scatter 100 people like startled birds. By the time I got back there, only the catering staff remained, scraping uneaten food into bins and talking in whispers. My best man, Theo, was standing by the gate, his tie loosened, his expression a mixture of confusion and guilt. He'd always been the optimist, the kind of guy who believed any argument could be fixed if people just talked long enough. That belief was dying in his eyes now. He didn't ask for details, just handed me a small box. Inside was the wedding ring. My initials were engraved beside hers. It looked expensive, deliberate, like a promise that never belonged to me in the first place. "She's not coming back, right?" Theo finally asked. "No," I said. "Not to this." He nodded once, then walked off without another word. I stayed there a while, standing under the archway she'd insisted on, a lattice of white roses and soft fairy lights. I remember thinking how much effort had gone into something that would last barely an afternoon. Maybe that was the metaphor I'd been missing all along. Her love had the lifespan of a rented decoration. I drove home again, but halfway there, my phone buzzed with a message from Renee's father. It was short, "We need to talk." Now, when I arrived at his house, the front door was wide open. He was sitting at the dining table, jacket off, tie hanging loose, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. The same man who once joked that I'd make a better husband than he ever had now looked broken, deflated. "She's staying with him," he said before I could speak. They didn't even leave the motel. She told her mother she's done pretending. His voice cracked slightly, but he covered it with a cough. "She told me she never wanted this wedding, that she didn't want you, or the family expectations, or any of it." He laughed once, short and bitter. "And yet she took everything. Every cent I gave her. Every deposit I trusted her with." That last line caught my attention. "Deposits?" He nodded. "The florist, the hotel, the catering, even the honeymoon bookings. All under her account. She wanted control over the finances, said it would make her feel independent." He rubbed his forehead, shaking his head slowly. "Turns out she drained the emergency fund. $38,000. Gone." I sat down across from him. The weight of it all pressed down like a physical force. The betrayal wasn't just emotional now. It was financial, social, and permanent. She took the money, he said again, quieter this time. For him, that was when something inside me hardened into focus. Not rage, just absolute clarity. The kind that makes you see all the strings you didn't realize you were holding. I spent the next hour on my laptop. Every account she'd logged into from my devices, every shared subscription, every booking confirmation I could access. I went through them all. The patterns lined up faster than I expected. Payments to a travel agency in his name. A new apartment lease under hers. Even a wire transfer labeled retainer. She'd planned this like a heist. Months in advance. By the time I closed the laptop, her father was pacing the kitchen, muttering that he'd raised a stranger. I told him what I found. He stopped pacing. Then, slowly, he sat back down and whispered, "You call the police, and she'll drag us all through the mud. She'll play the victim. You know she will." He was right. Renee had that kind of charisma, the kind that could twist any story into sympathy, the kind that made people believe her version first. "Let me handle it," I said. He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I'll make sure everyone knows what happened. Truthfully, without shouting, without lawyers. Just facts." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded once, like a man who'd already accepted he couldn't save his daughter from herself. That night, I started making calls. The venue, the hotel, the catering company. Every vendor had her name listed as the primary contact, her card as the payment source. I canceled everything under her name. Not refunds, cancellations. It meant she'd still get charged, but nothing would happen. Thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits. Thousands she couldn't replace. The next morning, the chain reaction began. The florist called her demanding clarification. The hotel management emailed her about the canceled suite. The travel agency revoked the honeymoon package due to disputed ownership of funds. By noon, she called me. I didn't answer. Then she texted, "You're ruining everything." Everything, in her vocabulary, didn't mean the relationship. It meant the performance. The illusion of a life she'd been building with stolen bricks. Her father called again that afternoon. He sounded calmer this time, almost grateful. "She came home screaming," he said. "Told me I'd betrayed her. Then she packed a bag and left." I asked if he knew where she went. "Back to him, I think. But it doesn't matter now. She's on her own." He paused. "You did what I couldn't, Callan. You made her face herself." It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was emptiness, the kind that comes after a long fever breaks. The realization that you're no longer sick, but you'll never be the same. 2 days later, I received an email from the motel owner. Apparently, the story had spread online. A local gossip page had caught wind of the runaway bride at the Greenway. Someone had leaked photos. Her father begged them to take it down, but by then it had already been shared dozens of times. I didn't post it. I didn't need to. The truth had its own gravity. Within a week, she lost her job. Her company, a small PR firm, couldn't have that kind of attention tied to their name. Dylan disappeared shortly after. Someone told me he'd been arrested in another county for unpaid fines. Meanwhile, the vendors started reaching out to me directly. Most of them refunded partial deposits out of pity. The rest offered credit for future use, as if I'd ever want to plan another wedding. Her mother sent me a letter, handwritten, apologizing for the humiliation and hoping I'd find someone worthy of your calm. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't sound rehearsed. The world moved on faster than I expected. People always do. But the silence between events, the part after the scandal dies down, that's where you find out what's really left. For me, it wasn't hatred. It was freedom. I changed my number, closed the joint bank account, donated her leftover wedding gifts to a local charity. For the first time in months, my life was entirely my own. A week later, I saw Renee one last time. Not in person, but on the local news feed, walking out of the courthouse beside her father. Apparently, he'd filed a small claims case to recover part of the money she'd taken. She looked thinner, pale, wearing sunglasses even though it was raining. The reporter's caption said, "Bride sues father over wedding deposits." That was the headline she earned. I watched the clip once, then closed the laptop. There was nothing more to see. She had laughed when I found her at the motel. That sound had followed me like a ghost for days. But now, thinking about it, I realized something. She hadn't laughed because she was happy or cruel. She laughed because she thought she was untouchable, because she believed the world would always bend to her excuses. But the world didn't. Not this time. And as I sat there, the ring box still on my kitchen table, I finally understood what real closure sounded like: silence. Months later, it was hard to believe any of it had actually happened. The wedding date had passed quietly, replaced by a normal Saturday where the only sound in my apartment was the hum of the refrigerator. The suit still hung in the closet, untouched, like an artifact from another life. I kept meaning to donate it, but something in me couldn't. Not sentimentality, just unfinished business. After the chaos died down, everyone had their version of what happened. Her family said she'd had a nervous breakdown. Her coworkers said she'd been pressured into marriage. Friends speculated about infidelity, money, or secret addictions. Nobody seemed interested in the truth because the truth was too plain. She made her choice, and the consequences followed. I didn't correct anyone. Silence was its own kind of power. Renee didn't contact me for almost 3 months. I assumed she was gone for good until one evening. While I was leaving the gym, I saw her name flash on my phone. The text preview was short. "We need to talk. It's important." I should have ignored it, but curiosity won. I met her at a coffee shop downtown. She looked smaller somehow, paler, thinner, the confidence gone from her posture. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled when she lifted her cup. She started by apologizing. Not sincerely, not with any real weight behind it, but with the kind of regret people show when they finally realize they're running out of places to hide. She said things had fallen apart, that Dylan had turned out to be unstable, that she'd made mistakes under pressure. I didn't say much. I just listened. When she mentioned that she'd lost her job in her apartment, I felt the faintest echo of pity, but it wasn't enough to speak. Then she dropped the real reason she'd called me. She said she was pregnant. For a few seconds, everything inside me went silent again. The same kind of silence I'd felt outside the motel door. She said it wasn't Dylan's. She said she'd been confused and wanted to believe in something stable. I watched her carefully. There was no warmth in her expression, no fear, no hope, just strategy. She was testing whether I'd still protect her, whether I'd still be that man she could rely on to clean up what she destroyed. So I told her I'd take care of it, that she should go to a clinic the next day and get a DNA test. I promised I'd cover the cost. She agreed too quickly. A week later, the results came back. Not mine, not Dylan's either. When I showed her the report, she barely reacted. She just closed her eyes, muttered something under her breath, and left the cafe without looking back. That was the last time I saw her in person. After that, she disappeared completely. Her social media vanished. Her number changed. The last I heard, through a friend of her father's, she'd moved out of state, working a minimum wage job at a roadside diner. Her family stopped speaking to her entirely. Her father sold his house to pay the debts she left behind. Her mother went to live with her sister. Sometimes people think betrayal ends in one sharp moment. It doesn't. It unfolds slowly, layer by layer, in the lives of everyone who trusted the wrong person. I rebuilt my life the same way, layer by layer. I transferred to another branch at work, moved into a smaller place closer to the coast, and started volunteering at an animal shelter on weekends. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up wondering what mood someone else would be in. I didn't walk on eggshells trying to keep the peace. The quiet was strange at first, but then it became addictive. One evening, I got a call from her father. His voice was softer now, lighter, like the exhaustion had finally left him. He said, "You did right, Callan. I couldn't see it then, but you did right." He told me he'd found peace by cutting all contact with her. I could hear relief in his tone, but also something like mourning, for the daughter he'd lost long before the motel. We talked for nearly an hour, not about her, but about other things. Work, the weather, a new dog he'd adopted. When he hung up, I realized that conversation meant more to me than any closure she could have offered. A few months later, I met someone new. Her name was Lena, a project coordinator at a local firm. We met by accident, literally. Her grocery cart hit mine in a parking lot, and she apologized so many times I couldn't help but laugh. There was nothing dramatic about it. No instant sparks or movie-style tension. Just something steady, real. I didn't tell her much about my past. Only what was necessary. She didn't ask for more. That was the beauty of it. No curiosity rooted in gossip. No pity disguised as understanding. Just presence. One night, we sat on the beach watching the tide come in. She asked why I never seemed angry about anything. I told her anger only traps people in the moment that hurt them most. Forgiveness wasn't about letting others off the hook. It was about untying yourself from the anchor. She smiled, said she liked that, and leaned her head on my shoulder. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was performing calmness. I was actually calm. Still, there were days when my mind wandered back to that morning. The missing bride, the motel, the laughter that followed me into my dreams for weeks. I'd catch myself replaying it, not out of pain, but curiosity. What kind of person laughs like that at the wreckage of their own choices? One evening, out of pure instinct, I checked the old contact list on my phone. Her number was still there, buried under hundreds of others. I hadn't blocked it, not because I wanted her to reach out, but because I didn't need to. Some wounds close without scars. Some simply fade until you forget where they were. I never deleted her number, and she never called again. Maybe she knew that silence was more final than any conversation we could have had. A year after it all, I attended a wedding, Theo's. His new wife asked how long I'd known him, and when I told her the story of how he'd once been my best man for a wedding that never happened, she laughed softly, not mockingly, just humanly. She said, "Then maybe that one fell apart, so this one could exist." Maybe she was right. On the way home, I drove past the old venue. The sign was gone. The property had been sold and turned into a restaurant. I parked for a moment and stared at the place where it had all come undone. There was a calm finality in seeing it repurposed, like even the ground beneath it had moved on. The ocean breeze carried a faint smell of lavender that reminded me of that day, but it didn't sting anymore. It was just another scent in the air. As I drove away, the sun was setting low over the water, turning everything gold. My phone buzzed once, a notification from a new message. It wasn't her. It was Lena, asking if I wanted to grab dinner. I smiled, put the phone down, and let it ring until the car was quiet again. Then I turned up the radio and drove home, no ghosts left to chase. For the first time since that morning, the world felt balanced again.